Northern Ireland Food and Drink Association represents about 80% by turnover of the food and drink companies in Northern Ireland. And in working our way through Brexit and the shock of Brexit, we have to find a way forward. So in this presentation, I want to identify the challenges, but also something that most people are coming up short with, which is possibilities on ways forward. In Northern Ireland, we cannot determine the final outcome. A number of businesses have been debating which scenario. Do we want a customs union? Do we want a comprehensive free trade agreement? The answer is it'll not be determined by the people of Northern Ireland. What we have to do is work out a game plan for each of those scenarios and figure out what the asks will be. There are probably about 4 or 5 different outcomes that could be with the relationship with Europe. The one that is the worst possible is no trade deal. And if that happens, it's basically exceptionally challenging for our industry going forwards. But for the other ones, there are ways forward if we can get in early and argue for the correct policies. The one that I talk about is what we refer to as the WTO Singapore scenario. WTO can have 2 scenarios. WTO standard tariffs, which are very high and will actually raise the price of food and drink in the UK. Or no tariffs, which is the way the Singapore operates, and the British government is sometimes referred to as global free trade, like in Singapore. The funny thing about Singapore is it's a city-state. It doesn't have an agricultural base, so it doesn't need to have tariffs to protect it. And it becomes quite dangerous when you hear people talking about replicating a model which doesn't have an agri-food industry. One thing that I would say is that the UK market is in deficit, and with the exception of that WTO Singapore tariff, the real question is if we start hitting some difficult roadblocks to a trade deal with Europe, can we reposition our industry to service the UK market? I want to look first of all at threats. Just to understand Northern Ireland and the border, 1/4 of the milk produced in Northern Ireland travels south for processing. A lot of that is probably turned into butter and cheese going into the UK. Half of the flour we produce goes into the south. 36% of the sheep we produce goes into the south. A lot of that goes on into countries like France, a market that is likely to be closed to us if we end up with a bad deal. But also our pig industry in the north is very dependent on pigs from the south. 1/3 of the pigs are slaughtered in the north come from the south. Without that supply base, we don't have the critical mass to have industries of scale selling into the UK. One thing is clear, within a trade deal in Europe, we can talk about the issue of the border and how it might be resolved. Outside of a trade deal with Europe, there can be no special arrangement for Northern Ireland and the border. And the problem with that, therefore, is Theresa May's statement that no deal is better than a bad deal is one I would strongly disagree with. No deal means no solutions could be found for the island of Ireland and in particular the cross-border trade. What if we get it wrong and we end up with a bad outcome? We have an industry that is a £4.6 billion turnover, of which 28% of it is exported outside of the UK. Now, the rest of the UK operates, in particular England operates on the basis it's an import region of the world for food. It doesn't need to think about exports. Northern Ireland is the flip side of that. We are an exporting region of the UK. We definitely need to think about exports. And the problem is policy in London does not comprehend the idea of exporting when you're a market in deficit. And I'll pick up on later why you need to export. But fundamentally, if there's no trade deal, 28% of our business cannot get into the market it's servicing. 92,000 jobs, or almost 12% of the working population in Northern Ireland, are directly or indirectly involved in agriculture. So it's a big issue for employment. But perhaps the biggest issue is what Northern Ireland looks like from an agricultural point of view. The blue dots represent farms, the green dots represent processing. If you end up with a consequence of destroying the agricultural production base, you destroy the rural economy. You destroy these towns and villages that depend on the spending income, not just of the farmer, but the businesses that support the farmer, the concrete businesses, the fabrication businesses, the ones that build the houses and support the milking parlours. And you end up with a decline in the rural economy, rural employment, quite devastating to the structure and fabric of society. That's what happens if we get it wrong. We talk about WTO tariffs. If we were to look at a trade deal or a failure to get a trade deal in Europe, we're facing the European tariff wall, and you'd be talking around 50% tariff on beef into the UK, into Europe, 47% on butter. Milk, a 30% tariff. 2 years ago, the farmers in Northern Ireland were getting 15p a litre. That's the tariff they'd have to sell. They'd have to pay getting milk into the Republic. So 2 years ago, if we had a hard Brexit, the 15p you got would pay the duty bringing it across the border. You'd get nothing. Labour is a big issue for us as well. We did a survey of our members to understand our exposure to non-UK labour. Although 50% of those employed in our factories are UK, 48% are EU, another 2% non-EU. In seasonal work, it's about 70 or 80% are non-UK labour. Uncertainty and exchange rates are already making it hard to replace people who leave. 2 years ago, £100 posted home was €143. Today it's €105 being posted home. Why would you stay in Northern Ireland? Why would you not go elsewhere where the paychecks enable you to post a larger cheque home to Poland or Czechoslovakia? Most recently, there has been a leaked document from the UK government talking about how to limit migration. And their focus, as it is in London, is, well, we only want skilled labour, we only want jobs over £30,000, that sort of approach. The problem is, with 50% of our labour being non-UK, and with the Northern Ireland marketplace almost at full employment, i.e. those who want to work, do work, where are we going to get the labour to deal with the churn? If the UK decide to bring in 100,000 people a year, we're 2.3% of the UK population. Does that mean we're allowed to bring 2,000 people in a year? And do those people have to be earning £30,000? And the one thing about the way the UK government does these things, as they did with the living wage, is they don't count things like productivity payments. They don't count piece rates. They say, what's the basic wage? A person could have a third of their salary or their income based on productivity bonuses. The UK complains we're not productive, and then they implement schemes that go against productivity. Absolutely amazing. But because they're not focused on agriculture, they're not thinking about these things. And of course, what you could do is offer another £1 an hour to bring people in. For a company employing 1,000 employees, their bill just went up by £2 million to try and cover some of the churn. Some of our businesses employ 4,000 or 5,000 people. A tightening labour market could easily put £10 million onto some of our businesses every year to deal with the consequences of restricted access to a labour market. Now, I find it interesting listening to some of the presentations earlier because a lot of work was done at a European level. The regional governments of the UK did not actually trust London to form an opinion on the impact of certain trading arrangements on UK agriculture. So together the regions of the UK commissioned FAPRI, which is an international research centre, to evaluate the impact on trade flows of tariff-free trading arrangements, of customs union, of various scenarios. And that report came out about a month and a half, 2 months ago. And they did 3 evaluations. The first one was customs union. The second one was WTO with high tariffs, which basically said, good if you're in agriculture in the UK. It's in deficit. You've just raised the price of entry. The price in the market will rise and everyone in agriculture is a winner. UK will never do that because of food inflation. The other one, which has often been espoused by people like Liam Fox, the guy out to get international trade, is let's be a trading nation, let's forget about tariffs. And FAPRI evaluated that, and FAPRI's view is the beef supply into the UK, the beef price in the UK market will fall by 50% as we move to world prices. Sheep will fall by about 39% or 38%. There isn't an industry that we have in Northern Ireland that doesn't take a hit on the back of a unilateral trade liberalisation. And when I've talked to government ministers in London, cheap food is important to the consumer. So you can see there's a leaning towards accessing cheaper markets. And my question back to them is, the saving to the consumer may be outweighed by the dole check to the rural economy. Have you really thought this one through? And often I get a double take. And that's why I have a big concern about the joining of the dots and the consequences of certain decisions here. And that's why information like this, which belongs to the regional devolved governments, help provide the ammunition to lobby London centrally on what needs to be done. But there are also opportunities here. If we look at the UK trade deficit that was referred to earlier, if you look at the poultry market, for example, we import £2 billion of poultry meat a year. We export 360, £1.6 billion gap. If we get excluded from the European market, we can redirect our production into the UK and service it. Dairy is an interesting one, and I take it as an example. There's a 600 million gap. You can see that where 20% of our butter is imported, 40% of our cheese is imported. A number of businesses in Northern Ireland say, this is great, let's have high tariffs. Let's keep the European product out and we'll grow our business to supply it. In particular, in the UK, if Northern Ireland lost its £600 million export market, could it not reposition itself to the £1.2 billion import market? That would require reinvestment and restructuring. We don't have cheese factories, we don't have butter factories to take all the milk we produce. There'd need to be a major restructuring, and we'd need to know now that's what we need to do to put the infrastructure in place. Meat is not as easy a substitute, and Vincent from Manor Farm, it's scary some of the points you're making are so well aligned to our points as well, as you'll see shortly on chicken. But we cannot fill the poultry gap without the export markets to take the leftover bits they don't want. And one thing that I have said to the players in the north, the deficit in the UK is too large for Northern Ireland to fill. If we tried to fill this deficit, our industry would need to be triple the size it is. Not possible. And if in adopting that approach, there's a shortage of food in the UK, we will end up seeing product from South America and Australia. So to use a phrase that Board Bia developed, co-opetition, I think there's a shared interest in making sure we don't go for cheap food in the UK because it'll damage our industries north and south. And by cooperating to win the arguments at a UK and European level is better than Northern Ireland trying to corner a market it can't support and end up resulting in a market flooded with cheaper food as a result. In Carcase Imbalance, which I thought was a very good presentation by Vincent, there is a natural level at which we can supply the UK market, and beyond that we stop. The UK is about 70% self-sufficient in the meat and dairy products that we produce. Pig, it's 55% self-sufficient, and the reason is very simple. For the first 40 or 50% of the animals you slaughter, you will be able to sell all the parts into the UK market. The next 5 or 10%, they don't want the wings. The next 5 or 10% after that, they don't want the legs. And so less and less of the animal is being sold. So all you're left with is growing a bird for breast meat. But you had to feed the whole bird. And that's the biggest challenge we face if we want to grow our share in the UK market. We actually need to grow our export markets. Northern Ireland needs to grow its exports to third countries if it's to fill the hole in the UK. You can't grow the breast of a bird without growing the bird. You can't grow the shoulders of a pig without growing the pig. And unless we have export markets, we cannot service a greater share of the UK market. And carcass imbalance equation is probably well demonstrated here. The breast to leg or thigh yield ratio is 1-to-1 basically. When you do a bird, 23% is breast meat, 23% thigh meat. UK, so if you wanted to satisfy the UK's market for breast meat of 122,000 tonnes, you will produce 122,000 tonnes of leg meat. But the UK only takes 75,000 tonnes of it. So what do? If you don't have an export market for the 47, you will never be able to supply the 122. And that's the challenge that we have in the north, that we're saying to the UK government, we need export markets, just as Vincent said he needs export markets. The problem is London has always been focused on importing food, not on exporting it. They never invested in getting access to Asia, and therefore we have a mountain to climb if we're servicing the UK market to find a home for the bits the UK don't want. So it's not as easy as substitution without export markets. And the UK has singularly failed in decades to develop those export markets. What I put together is a traffic light system here to give you a flavour of customs union, comprehensive free trade agreement, EU trade agreement with tariffs and quotas, no trade agreement. Customs union, the ideal view of Europe, a common customs border that will allow a light touch of policing a border between Northern Ireland and the south. If there's no duty to be collected, why do you need to have a heavy hand on the border? However, FAPRI has said the paperwork alone will add 5% to your transaction costs of moving goods across the border, having to comply with the regulations required in selling in, even within a customs union, into Europe. And there's also this issue of sanitary and phytosanitary regulations, which is making sure food and drink brought into Europe are not contaminated in any shape or form. So FAPRI have said, day one, you're going to find a lot of paperwork at the border, even in a customs union, and you're going to find a charge for exporting into the export markets. UK wants a comprehensive free trade agreement, which basically means they sell into Europe and then run around and do really cheap deals with everybody else. That will create a backdoor risk to Europe. The cheap food and drink will come through, hormone-enriched beef, and therefore you can be absolutely sure in a comprehensive free trade agreement, Europe will beef up, if you pardon the expression, its border controls to make absolutely sure product from America under a low tariff does not slip into Europe through Ireland. And so I find it quite amazing that the UK government keep talking about these light touch customs arrangements. Of course they do, because the risk doesn't sit with the UK government, it sits with Europe. That low priced products will flow into Europe without meeting the tariff. It's not going to be high priced products flowing into the UK because they crashed the price when they bought their beef from America and their chicken from Thailand. So given the two diametrically opposed positions, my anxiety is we end up in a fudge called a trade agreement with tariffs and quotas. And again, that will still require border checks, duty to be paid, the risk of smuggling, bad for the border, bad for the economy, as we end up finding cost restrictions and tariff restrictions to getting into Europe. The final one, no trade agreement with WTO, bad for our exports, great for the industry. It'll be so bloody expensive, you'll not be able to export into the UK, and it leaves a market in deficit we're supplying. Absolutely no way UK will go for that model. That actually leaves the WTO no tariff model, which Liam Fox is a proponent of, and it's a disaster for everybody. No tariffs means the cheapest into the market will win. Irish beef will be displaced by Argentine beef, Irish cheese by possibly New Zealand cheese. And we in the north also will be unable to compete at this level. And so our challenge is to make sure at all times we avoid that. What are the fixes we might adopt in all of these issues? In the customs union, the UK government did come out in its paper with this issue about a recognised business operator from a customs point of view, that you don't need a piece of paper with every consignment, you can do monthly returns. That business model already exists. It runs in Europe, it's recognised by the US, it's being recognised in China, that you move away from paperwork, consignment by consignment, to monthly declarations. So it's a good proposal by the UK, and actually Irish businesses selling into Europe via the land bridge may need to adopt the same model. but we have to make sure it's practical and businesses can easily get qualified or recognized as business operators. And for SMEs, we have to make sure that that the simplicity of their businesses is recognized in the regulation applied to them. In terms of tariffs and quotas, the UK government again and NIFDA have been lobbying about this, did table the Cyprus model. And the Cyprus model is the north of Cyprus is outside the EU practically. It has a border called the Green Line, and there has been a position of political unrest and civil war basically along that border. Europe offered tariff-free access to that region of Cyprus into Europe. And if something like that was offered to Northern Ireland, you could possibly overcome these issues of getting through the border and the tariff wall. If it was something offered to Northern Ireland and to underpin the Good Friday Agreement. So Cyprus is a good precedent, but the key thing in Cyprus is the goods have to originate in the north of the island. An animal has to be born and reared on the island before it can get tariff-free access. The leather from the animals have to come from animals that are born and reared. So there can be no backdooring if you have the traceability systems we have in Northern Ireland to ensure that only goods that originate, are born and bred in the north can travel south. And that might be one solution to the border if we can't solve it any other way. In terms of the Republic of Ireland, the clever thing is to look at quota. Because, for example, 98% of the pigs, live pigs imported into the UK is the trade south to north. If we can't get a free trade deal, why don't we just put in quota for live animal movements so that the southern pig farmer still has access to the northern market? And being selective, the beef industry, about 68% of the beef imported into the UK comes from Ireland. So giving quota or giving low tariffs for that, 2/3 of what the UK get will come from Ireland anyway. So being very selective in what you do with quota and targeting the existing trade flows might actually alleviate some of the problems that we have. You just have to be smart with what you do with tariffs on existing trade flows. And all I can say about WTO is, no way. We have to stop it. It will be devastating to our industries north and south. Taking out that scenario 3, tariffs and opportunities for quota, I went and got some more statistics. 96% of the milk and cream exported by the UK is to Ireland. That makes no sense unless you think it is the milk and cream coming from Northern Ireland. A quarter of what we produce goes south. Nearly all of what the UK exports is from Northern Ireland, and it's £270 million a year. Again, milk flows for butter, 60% imported into the UK from Ireland. Live animals, 98% of pigs, live pigs imported from the EU is from Ireland. 74% of live beef animals, but it's quite small. It's only 12 million. But currencies and exchange rates can create big flows there. So being clever with tariffs might at least give access to the beef farmer into the UK market through working on the tariffs that really only the trade flow on an island can replicate. And of course meat, 77% of the meat we import into the UK comes from Ireland, and 36% of the sheep goes south. So if you can't do the free trade deal, if you can't get the customs union, perhaps you have to start being very clever with your trade flows and targeting the things that most benefit the island. So my conclusion, European wants a customs union. It avoids the consequences of Europe otherwise being unable to compete. If there's a customs union, the price in the UK will remain what it is. Ireland will continue to have access to it. And it's very much status quo, but with a lot of paperwork at the border. The UK position is a comprehensive free trade agreement. And the moment they start doing cheap deals with other countries around the world is the moment it'll pressure the border. And I really don't see Europe accepting a comprehensive free trade deal, which basically says you can sell into Europe, but the UK is so cheap because we source from the world, you can't compete in the UK market. It will become a one-way flow. So I don't see how that will work. And the compromise is, as I said, tariffs and quotas. The north-south, possibly dealt with under the Cyprus model. The east-west, origin. Now, I'm not talking about origin as in labelling it Irish. I'm talking about origin as in what counts as European under customs rules. And by that 25% of the milk going south could continue to be processed in factories on the border in the south, sent back to England with no tariffs because of the rules of origin. But let's make sure it's part of the deal and not forget about it. In fact, let's bend these rules of origin to enable much of the existing north-south trade that is processed and value added in the south to get back into the UK. And quota is the sniper's rifle, if you pardon the expression. That's me. Thank you.